On September 2nd, 1945, the day Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, an American military photographer captured what appeared to be a perfect moment of celebration. A newly liberated Air Force pilot, Captain James Sullivan, surrounded by fellow freed prisoners, smiling weakly at the camera just hours after American forces liberated the POW camp where he'd been held for nearly 3 years. The photograph was published in Life magazine on September 17, 1945, with the caption, "Freedom at last. American POWs celebrate liberation in the Pacific." For 76 years, this photograph existed as a symbol of survival and victory. But in 2021, when James Sullivan's granddaughter discovered letters her grandmother had kept hidden for decades, she learned something that transformed that celebration photo into one of the most heartbreaking images from World War II. The smiling man in that photograph would return home to his family 3 weeks later. But the husband and father they had known was gone forever. And what the photograph couldn't show, was that James Sullivan would spend the next 32 years unable to recognize his own wife and children, his mind so shattered by captivity that the faces of the people he loved most had become strangers. Subscribe now, because this isn't a story about liberation. It's a story about how sometimes surviving is worse than dying, and how a photograph of celebration can hide a tragedy beyond comprehension. September 23, 1945. San Francisco, California. The USS General Mitchell docked carrying 1,247 American servicemen returning from the Pacific Theater, including Captain James Sullivan, age 32. A B-29 pilot who had been shot down over the Philippines in November 1942 and held as a prisoner of war by Japanese forces for 34 months. Margaret Sullivan stood on the dock with her 2 children, Bobby, age 8, and Susan, age 6, holding a "Welcome Home Jim" sign she'd stayed up all night making. She hadn't seen her husband in 3 years. The children barely remembered their father. Bobby had vague memories of a man who used to throw him in the air and catch him. Susan had been only 3 when her father deployed, and had no real memories at all beyond photographs her mother showed her. Margaret had received the telegram 6 weeks earlier. "Your husband, Captain James Sullivan, liberated from Japanese POW camp." August 27th. Stop condition. Serious but stable. Stop returning stateside. Soon. Stop details to follow. She had cried for hours, tears of joy and relief after 3 years of not knowing if Jim was alive or dead, of raising 2 children alone, of lying awake at night, imagining the worst. For 6 weeks, Margaret prepared for Jim's homecoming. She cleaned their small house in Oakland until it gleamed. She bought new clothes for the children so they'd look their best for Daddy. She cooked Jim's favorite meals and froze them so she could heat them up when he came home. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would hold him, how they would rebuild their life together now that the war was over and he was coming home safe. When the ship docked and the gangway was lowered, Margaret watched hundreds of servicemen stream down onto the pier, looking for Jim's face in the crowd. Some men ran to waiting families. Some walked slowly, carefully, supported by medics. Some were carried on stretchers. Margaret's heart pounded as she scanned each face, holding Bobby's hand tightly, Susan clinging to her other arm. Then she saw him. Or rather, she saw someone who looked like a skeletal version of Jim, perhaps 100 pounds lighter than when he'd left, his face gaunt and sunken, his movements slow and uncertain. He wore a clean military uniform, that hung loosely on his emaciated frame. A Red Cross worker walked beside him, guiding him gently down the gangway. Margaret's first thought was, "Oh my God, what did they do to him?" Her second thought was, "It's okay. He's home now. I'll take care of him. He'll recover. We'll be okay." She was wrong about almost everything. Margaret rushed forward, tears streaming down her face, pulling the children with her. "Jim! Jim! We're here! It's Margaret! It's Bobby and Susan! We're here!" Jim stopped walking. He looked at her. His eyes, sunken, hollow, surrounded by dark circles, showed no recognition, no joy, no relief, nothing. He stared at Margaret as if she were a stranger. Then he looked at Bobby and Susan with that same blank, uncomprehending gaze. The Red Cross worker spoke quietly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Clara Watson. I've been working with your husband during the voyage. I need to prepare you for something. Captain Sullivan he's experiencing significant cognitive difficulties, memory problems. He's having trouble recognizing people and places. The doctors believe it's a combination of severe malnutrition, possible head trauma, and psychological shock from his captivity experience." Margaret heard the words, but couldn't process them. She looked at Jim, standing 3 feet away, staring at her with absolutely no recognition in his eyes. "Jim?" she whispered. "Jim, it's me. It's Margaret, your wife. Don't you know me?" Jim's mouth moved slightly, but no words came out. He looked confused, lost, frightened. He looked at the 2 children clinging to this crying woman and showed no emotion at all, no recognition, no connection, nothing. Bobby, age 8, started crying. "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy remember us?" Margaret had no answer, because the man standing in front of her looked like her husband. But the person inside that skeletal body, the man she'd loved, the father of her children, the person she'd built a life with, was gone. And she would spend the next 3 decades learning that some things the war takes away never come back. 21 days earlier, August 27th, 1945, a Japanese POW camp near Fukuoka, Japan. The photograph that would appear in Life magazine was taken by U.S. Army photographer Corporal David Chen approximately 2 hours after American forces entered the camp and declared it liberated. The image shows a group of emaciated American prisoners, many so thin their ribs are clearly visible even through their clothing, standing together in what appears to be the camp's main yard. In the center right of the photograph stands a man identified in the photo's caption as Captain James Sullivan, U.S. Army Air Forces. Sullivan appears to be smiling, a slight upward curve of his lips, his eyes looking toward the camera. Other prisoners around him show various expressions. Some are genuinely smiling, some are crying. Some look shocked or dazed. Some have blank expressions, suggesting they haven't fully comprehended that their ordeal is over. The photograph captures what seems to be a moment of pure relief and joy. Liberation, survival, freedom after years of captivity. But what the photograph doesn't show, what no photograph could show, is what Captain James Sullivan was actually experiencing at that moment when Corporal Chen took his picture. Sullivan's military medical records, declassified in 1995 and obtained by his granddaughter in 2021, provide details that transform the interpretation of that celebration photograph. Patient, Captain James Sullivan, Service Number 1, 758-8364-2. Initial examination, August 27th, 1945. 1,400 hours, immediately following camp liberation. Patient is conscious but severely disoriented, does not respond appropriately to questions, cannot state his name, rank, or home location when asked. Appears confused about surroundings and situation. Physical examination reveals severe malnutrition, estimated body weight 98 pounds, pre-war weight documented as 180 pounds, indicating loss of 82 pounds, 45% of body weight. Multiple old fractures poorly healed. Extensive scarring, consistent with beatings and torture. Evidence of chronic dysentery and probable tuberculosis. Dental condition extremely poor, with multiple missing teeth. Most concerning, patient shows signs of severe neurological or psychological impairment. Does not recognize fellow prisoners he was held with for months. Cannot recall recent events. Appears to have significant memory loss and cognitive dysfunction. Preliminary diagnosis: severe malnutrition with associated neurological damage. Probable traumatic brain injury. Patient reports being beaten about the head repeatedly during captivity. And severe psychological trauma consistent with prolonged captivity under brutal conditions. Prognosis uncertain. The examining physician, Major Robert Harrison, wrote a separate note in Sullivan's file. This patient's cognitive impairments are among the most severe I have encountered in liberated POW population. He appears unable to form or retain new memories and has lost substantial portions of his previous memories. He does not remember his family or home. When shown photographs of his wife and children found in his personal effects, he shows no recognition. Patient is physically and psychologically devastated. Full recovery questionable. So when Corporal Chen took that photograph on August 27, 1945, what appears to be Captain James Sullivan smiling in celebration was actually a severely brain-damaged man who couldn't remember his own name, who didn't understand where he was or what was happening, who had no memory of his wife or children waiting for him back home, who was smiling reflexively at the camera because some deep instinct made him respond to a photographer's lens the way humans do, but who had no comprehension that he was free, that the war was over, that he had survived, or that he would soon be going home to a place and people he could no longer remember. The photograph shows liberation, but liberation and freedom are not the same thing. You can be released from a prison, but still remain trapped. Captain James Sullivan's body left that POW camp on August 27, 1945. But his mind, the person he had been, the memories that made him who he was, the connections to the people he loved, remained imprisoned forever in the hell he'd endured for 34 months. Captain James Sullivan's B-29 bomber was shot down over the Philippines on November 14, 1942, during a bombing raid on Japanese positions. Sullivan and 3 crew members survived the crash and evaded Japanese forces for 6 days before being captured. The other 3 crew members were executed by Japanese soldiers within hours of capture. Sullivan was spared, not out of mercy, but because Japanese forces needed intelligence about American air operations. Sullivan was transported to a POW camp near Manila, where he was held for 8 months before being moved to a camp in Taiwan, and finally transferred in early 1945 to Fukuoka POW Camp No. 17 in southern Japan, where he would remain until liberation. The 34 months Sullivan spent in Japanese captivity represented a systematic destruction of a human being, documented through his post-liberation medical records, testimony from fellow prisoners who survived, and Sullivan's own fragmented accounts given during psychiatric evaluations in the 1950s. The physical torture was extensive and methodical. Beatings with bamboo rods and rifle butts, particularly to the head. Water torture. Being forced to kneel on sharp stones for hours. Being locked in small boxes in extreme heat. Having fingernails removed. Being denied medical care for injuries and infections. Fellow prisoner Lieutenant Carl Morrison testified in 1946. War crimes trials that Sullivan was subjected to special attention because he was an officer and pilot. They particularly targeted Captain Sullivan. I witnessed him being beaten about the head and face with rifle butts on multiple occasions. He was knocked unconscious at least 5 times that I personally witnessed. After one beating in March 1944, Sullivan didn't speak coherently for 2 weeks and seemed confused about where he was. The malnutrition was catastrophic. Daily rations consisted of small portions of rice mixed with sand and weevils, occasional thin soup, and virtually no protein or vegetables. Prisoners lost massive amounts of weight and muscle mass. Diseases spread unchecked. Dysentery, beriberi, tuberculosis, malaria. Men died daily. By the time Sullivan was liberated, he weighed 98 pounds, down from 180 pounds, and his body had begun consuming its own muscle tissue and organs to survive. But the psychological torture proved most devastating. Sullivan witnessed atrocities that shattered his mind. Fellow prisoners executed for minor infractions, men dying slowly from starvation and disease, guards forcing prisoners to watch as others were tortured. Morrison testified. Captain Sullivan was forced to watch as guards beat Lieutenant Thomas Parker to death for stealing food. Sullivan had tried to protect Parker by claiming he was the one who stole the food. The guards beat Parker to death anyway, while making Sullivan watch. After that, Sullivan was never the same. He stopped talking much. He would stare at nothing for hours. The head trauma was particularly catastrophic. Dr. Harrison's examination noted, patient reports being struck in the head with rifle butts or fists, too many times to count. Patient states he was knocked unconscious on at least 10 occasions, maybe more, I don't remember. Patient shows signs consistent with multiple traumatic brain injuries, difficulty forming new memories, loss of existing memories, confusion, disorientation, inability to recognize familiar people or places. This pattern suggests cumulative brain damage from repeated head trauma. By early 1945, according to Morrison's account, Sullivan had essentially lost touch with reality. He would have conversations with people who weren't there. He would talk about his wife and kids but couldn't remember their names. Sometimes he'd forget where he was and ask why we were camping outside. He'd forget conversations we'd had minutes earlier. He was physically alive, but mentally, he was slipping away. When American forces liberated the camp on August 27, 1945, they found Sullivan alive. But the Jim Sullivan who had been shot down in November 1942 no longer existed. The 34 months of torture, starvation, disease, and repeated head trauma had destroyed not just his body, but his mind, his memories, his very identity. The person who returned to San Francisco on September 23, 1945, wore Jim Sullivan's face and bore his name. But the husband Margaret had loved, and the father Bobby and Susan had known, was gone. Destroyed in a Japanese POW camp, never to return. James Sullivan lived for 32 years after his liberation, dying in 1977 at age 64 from complications related to his wartime injuries and captivity. Those 32 years represented not recovery or healing, but a prolonged tragedy for Sullivan and his family. A daily reminder that survival is not the same as living, and that sometimes the war doesn't end when the shooting stops. Sullivan never recovered his memories of his pre-war life. Despite extensive psychiatric treatment at veterans' hospitals throughout the 1940s and 1950s, he never remembered Margaret as his wife, never formed a real connection with Bobby or Susan as his children, never recalled his childhood, his wedding, his home, his career as a pilot, or virtually anything about his life before captivity. His long-term memory was largely destroyed. His short-term memory was severely impaired. He would forget conversations minutes after having them, couldn't remember what he'd eaten for breakfast, would get lost in his own neighborhood. Margaret tried desperately to help him remember. She showed him photographs, told him stories about their courtship and marriage, brought him to places they'd visited together before the war. Nothing worked. Jim would look at wedding photos of himself and Margaret and see strangers. He would look at baby pictures of Bobby and Susan and feel nothing. The connections were gone, burned away by starvation, beaten out by rifle butts, erased by trauma too severe for the human brain to process and survive intact. Bobby and Susan grew up with a father who lived in their house but didn't know them. Family letters preserved by Margaret and discovered after her death revealed the devastating impact. Bobby, age 14, in 1951. Dad forgot my name again today. Mom had to remind him. He called me the boy all day. I hate him sometimes. I know it's not his fault, but I hate that he doesn't remember me. I hate that I have to live with this stranger who looks at me like he's never seen me before. Susan, age 18, in 1957. I'm going away to college, and I realize Dad won't miss me because he doesn't know who I am. I don't have a father. I have a damaged man living in my house who my mother takes care of. That's not the same thing. My friends talk about their dads, and I have nothing to say because my dad doesn't exist anymore. Margaret stayed with Jim for 32 years, serving as his full-time caregiver, explaining to him daily who she was, managing his medications and doctor appointments, protecting him from a world he could no longer navigate independently. She never remarried after his death. When asked why she stayed, she told her daughter Susan, "Because he's still my husband, even if he doesn't remember me. The war took him from me, but I wouldn't abandon him. He survived hell. The least I can do is make sure his remaining years are as comfortable as possible." Jim's psychiatric records from the VA document a man trapped in a permanent present, unable to form lasting memories or maintain emotional connections. Patient continues to show profound anterograde amnesia, inability to form new memories, and severe retrograde amnesia, loss of pre-existing memories. Patient does not recognize family members even after repeated introductions. Patient shows flat affect and inability to form emotional bonds. Patient appears confused about his identity and circumstances. Patient sometimes believes he is still a prisoner and becomes agitated. Treatment options exhausted. Prognosis: no improvement expected. Jim died on March 15, 1977, at home, with Margaret holding his hand. His last words, according to Margaret, were, "Who are you?" She had been his wife for 38 years. She had cared for him for 32 of those years, and he died not knowing her name. At Jim's funeral, Bobby, now 40, married with children of his own, gave a brief eulogy. "My father died in a Japanese POW camp in 1943 or 1944. What came home in 1945 was a shell, a ghost, a body without the person inside it. I don't remember him as he was before the war. I only knew him as the broken man who lived in our house, who my mother cared for with patience I couldn't understand as a child, but have come to respect as an adult." The war took my father from me before I was old enough to know him. It took my mother's husband and left her with a stranger to care for. It robbed all of us of the life we should have had. This funeral is decades late. We're burying a man who died long ago, but at least now he's finally at peace. The 1945 Liberation photograph of Captain James Sullivan hangs in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, with a caption explaining the full story. The smiling man in that photograph looks like he's celebrating. But he was already gone, his mind destroyed, his memories erased, his future stolen. Sometimes the most devastating war casualties are the ones who survive.